to ICT. Many of you, well, all of you here are familiar with Woeser's work, particularly probably her commentary on blogs. And since the wave of protests that swept across the Tibetan plateau from March the 10th onwards this year for a period of around 6 months, we've monitored more than 125 protests across Tibet. Woeser has been documenting these incidents with sometimes heartbreaking honesty and human stories almost every day, attracting around 3 million readers to her blogs. Now, the new book which we're introducing today, which is called Tibet's True Heart, and which is beautifully translated by Andrew Clark, who we're privileged and happy to have on the panel today. We hope that a new audience will come to know Woeser's work as a writer, as an artist, as a humanist, in addition to her role as a political commentator. And these are poems that she's written over a period of 20 years, and they chart her development as an individual, as a human being, her discovery of her past, her discovery about her father and mother's lives after growing up in a privileged and elite background, and also her discovery of what is happening to her country and to her faith as a Tibetan Buddhist. So it seems that over the last few months we've been witnessing something of a trend of Tibetans speaking out at tremendous cost to themselves, at tremendous risk. For instance, we've seen a Labrang monk called Jigme giving a testimony to VOA television, which was uploaded onto YouTube in very vivid detail of his arrest and imprisonment in March and his feelings about His Holiness and the political situation. We've seen the detentions of 2 filmmakers who made Leaving Fear Behind a very vivid portrayal from Tibetan interviewees of the situation inside their country, again at great risk. And then, of course, we're seeing Woeser almost every day speaking out, demonstrating the importance of speaking truth, of being eloquent about the situation inside Tibet. So we do hope that through this book of poems, Woeser's work will reach new audiences, new worlds beyond the Tibet circle. Already we've been hearing of readings in different countries of her work and her poems. I heard recently of a reading in Poland where many people were reduced to tears by her work and her stories of oppression. Obviously some resonances there with a former communist country. So it's work with a potential to appeal to many people across the world facing oppression and people who have suffered oppression. So I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly. Then each member of the panel will speak, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. So I'd first like to introduce our friend Susan Chen, who is a doctoral candidate doing a Ph.D. in the Graduate Institute of the Liberal Arts at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I first met Susan in Dharamsala some years ago, where Susan was doing excellent work with young Tibetans, the new generation of Tibetans who speak Tibetan, Chinese and English, who've come from the plateau, and doing wonderful work working with them, outreaching to Chinese Tibetans, and working with Tibetan writers too, and other Tibetan poets as well as Woeser. So Susan has been an observer of Tibetan contemporary culture and society since 2000, and her dissertation is about the human geography of Dharamsala, based on her fieldwork in Dharamsala. Susan is a regular reader and occasional translator of works by Woeser and her husband Wang Lishong, and some of the first work to be published was translated by Susan, who's also in frequent contact with the couple, with Woeser and Wang Lishong. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay. thank you for this occasion. Thank you for Dentula, organize all for this. And personally for me, this actually gave me such a pleasure because to prepare this 10 minutes. And actually, even this 10 minutes, I want to say is the collaboration between Woeser and me. And primarily it's her, okay? I'm the one just basically can only say because she is not here today with us. So I would try to address what happened to her as a blogger from her own perspective. And after I get accepted this arrangement by Dentula, and we actually get on Skype and had quite a bit of a chat for 3-4 times just for this. And what I feel is needed to come out with her is how she herself perceive what happened. And I hope everybody had a chance to get these handouts, and we made it together. And so basically, blog is a new phenomenon, global-wise, and Woeser pretty much you can pretty much fairly to say is the first wave of bloggers in China already. So her first blog launched in January 2005, and then if you quickly kinds of glimpse through what I put at the bottom, and you can see how many events just happened within these 3 years. And so our conversation primarily, I want to draw out from her. Actually, she talk. I just couldn't, recreate that storyteller's quality she has. Okay, so forgive me for that. So basically, our conversation is about these kinds of a contrast. When blog is a kind of a new media, what's that mean to her, and how she experience as a blog. And also at that stage, she was also a constant visitor to other Tibetans' blogs. And at the meantime, she actually, that I think we should also keep in the perspective. In the early days, she is not only run her own blog as the way she would describe it as her own magazine. She's a magazine, okay, a literature magazine. That's the way she foresees it. And of course, she's the writer. She provided the short story, the poems, and for me, I myself trained as an anthropologist, and she is also a fantastic ethnographer, and documents pretty much everything happened. For instance, in the tea house in Lhasa, no one else can have that in-depth perspective of what's going on. But at that stage, you can always find her here, there in other young Tibetans blogs, and then there, she will be the commentator. And so at that stage, there's kinds of a vibrance going on, and Woeser at that point was not alone to see the blog as a new media, as new space. You can try to express something otherwise in the mainstream media in China is impossible. And we talk about at that stage, I say, okay, can you give me just one instance? And the kinds of now in retrospect, and you think she feel the most significant. And then we went back to, I hope most of the audience here will remember that fur burning instance in 2006. Yeah, fur,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And that's a kind of a phenomenon, and can probably sum up best, the early stage of her blog work. And that it started with someone just literally send 2 lines of a very quick remark about what's happened in Amdo, and the people determined stop worrying the firm and anymore, and so they decided to show their determination by stage these kinds of events. And so there's really literally there's 2 lines that someone sent to Woeser's blog, and then she think that is interesting, so she made a separate entry and post for that day, and immediately within 24 hours hundreds of people get on, and then people start to debate about pro or con, and at a very early stage that the debates is actually started with among Tibetans themselves, which is, I feel, is very significant. That is the stage. Not all Tibetans feel this group, try to organize this way of action is proper. Some of them have quite a wide range of opinion, and then there's a Chinese readers, also jump in, and some of them actually think that is the right thing to do, and the Tibetans happen to be the ones think that is not the right thing to do. So the discussion is vibrant, and I joke with her at that stage. It really feels like that's the whole blog is her living room, and the people are in and out, and sometimes she hosts the people, sometimes she will just stick her head into the virtual space, say, okay, I have to go to Jokan now, I'll be back in 2 hours. And then she disappeared. And then a few hours later, she will join in, the debates. So there's that kind of exchange going on. And but if you follow what's that event on the ground, and then at one stage, when the so-called authorities start to step in, and the issues start to be politicized, become a Chinese versus Tibetan, the government versus people. And then at that stage, you can also see, the participants of her blog start to change. Those kinds of turn into something as though is Woeser as the blog try to incite something, and then invite, the attacking and the kinds of very polarized speech start to kind of pop out, and so that is a kind of give you a gist of, if you are day-to-day participants of her blog, you can see how quickly that cyber community was forming. There's at one point there's really that potential. You can actually see the way, or now in retrospect, actually can be said quite naively, think that there's a chance for the, relatively speaking, more open discussion and alternative thinking. And but that's actually just like a lot of other scholars in China now talking about, whether democracy actually is getting, not rather than as the way in the early stage people think, might actually help by the blog as new form of communication, and actually there's a regression going on. And so by the time Woeser's blog gone to two, three runs of censorship, and then things changed. And even before what happened, in this spring 2008, her previous blog and one is no longer operated from within China, need the so-called process to access, including herself. In other words, even just do the daily editing work, she has to kind of log in, and then once she log in, actually this whole system is operated from the States, and then through the proxies and back to the way she herself can perceive. And so at that point, her readership dropped from the peak of fern burning instance we're just talking about, is about the highest point, about 8,000 visitors per day. And the drop to the pre-spring 2008 is about 1,000, 2,000. It's a huge drop, and that drop, according to herself, the simple explanation is most of people, particularly for the Tibetans in China, just don't have that kind of sophisticated praxis. Relatively speaking, still more sophisticated than most of the people can handle. That is one thing, and another thing is she actually heard a lot of people fear about, say, if I use a proxy to access anything online, I might leave some kind of track, on my computer, on my hard drive. One day I might get caught. So that's pretty much, her blog become a site witness, that level of fear. And now we actually see in the larger Tibetan plateau on the ground, but also in the virtual space. And then, of course, after spring this year, now things get even more trickier. It's actually she herself say that it's kind of on the one hand, she is at the current moment feel exhausted by doing blog, and you can imagine at the peak of March this year, even she herself has to operate through the censorship, start to censor certain attacking message. There are hundreds every day, the 4-letter words. Worse than that, everybody come to the blog, to dump the garbage. And it's disgusting to see. At one point, she herself turned to become a censor, has to censor them. And then, but also simultaneous, what happened is also the form of censorship itself changed. All of the most recent trouble her blog gets is attacked by the so-called hackers. And until this point, no one knows if these hackers are really just average citizens took upon themselves, or is the official censorship and took on different incarnation. And at this point, we're not very clear. So between our two conversations, the first one, she said she is kind of feels like she still feels responsible to keep the current format of the blog, but at the same time, she admits it's kind of exhaustion. And of course, you can never stop her. And then the next conversation, 48 hours later, I say, oh, you must feel better today. Because she just start to say, but actually I start to feel this current blog start to have her own life. And she start to feel, rather than the early stage, this kind of the hostess in the living room and the in and out, that relationship with the blog as her baby. Now it's kind of, I keep my citizens' responsibility to maintain it, to manage it, to update it. But the way she says is when I start to take a step back, feel I'm distancing with it. And interestingly, actually, is the blog itself now start to grow into its own new lives. And for instance, if you go to the very bottom of this page, and the new development is, for instance, another Chinese woman based in British actually took upon herself and start to convert all of her blog pieces into from the simplified edition in Chinese to the traditional scripts. In order, the idea is to reach the larger Chinese readership. Those still have not feel comfortable to read, the simplified scripts, and might be able to access. And I think in that sense, that means this blog now is actually go beyond the Chinese readership in mainland China. It's intended for the target to the audience, in the place like Taiwan or Singapore, and the larger Chinese world. And another just developments, just even now, just last month, is there's an English edition of her blog. start to be launched from, I think also from Britain, yeah, from somewhere in London. And people at this stage, Woeser doesn't really directly involve in the operation of the English edition, but there's enough of volunteers to take upon themselves, start to translate her Chinese, the original blocks, into the new formats. So she herself at this point say, okay, something happened, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and I'm not quite sure. I know I'm going to continue it, but I haven't really found out all that happened in spring. Of course, I have to tell to a sensitive writer like herself, and so she's still in the transition to find out the new voice as a writer, but at the same time, the blog itself as a public forum, if we can call it, and start to kind of turn into some new dynamics. And so I think she herself is watching. I'm curious about it, and I hope this chart will help you. If you're curious, just go on to visit any of these, and will be always a surprise. For instance, for all those earlier blogger, now is no longer exist, but her work, she actually turned her blog into a book. When this book was published in Taiwan, was marketed as the first multimedia literature by a Tibetan writer. Okay, so if you guys want to pass around, you can get the gist of how she actually is as a creator, producer, and of one blog, but the quality and the way she wants her blog, to convey it to the audience. You can probably get the gist of from the format of this book. Okay. Sorry, I probably use more than that 10 minutes I'm allowed.
That's fine, you're allowed. Yes.
Sorry.
No problem. Particularly as you were speaking, at least partly after conversations with Woeser, we wanted to give you the space. So I'm going to introduce next Tseten Wangchuk, who's a senior research fellow at the Tibet Center of the University of Virginia, also works at VOA Tibetan Service. He was born and raised in Lhasa. Like Susan, has known Woeser for many years and communicated with her. He completed his BA in Tibetan history at the Central Nationalities Institute in Beijing and his MA in public policy and international affairs at Columbia University in New York. He was also a researcher at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing until 1996, and many of you will know that he founded, edited and co-published Tibet Forum, the first Chinese language magazine on Tibetan affairs in exile, based in Washington, D.C. So, Tseten, I'll hand over to you.
I know Woeser for quite some time, and somebody who sort of personally know her for many years, and also followed her writings for many years before she becoming famous. Is sort of on the way to here, I have sort of dilemma, and what kind of talk I should give. Give some very personal accounts, and just looking into her writing and her personal life, the path she took. Or I think just put her in some kind of perspective, a historical perspective, put her in this particular time in China and Tibet and internationally, and just sort of describe a generation of Tibetans that who now come to becoming a group that is going to be increasingly important in Tibetan politics, and not just only for the politics of Tibet, but politics within Tibet. And so I thought, in the end, I think I should give some broader sort of historical perspective, put her into that, would ultimately maybe also help people to understand her better and her writings better than just giving her a straight story about her. I think is with the represent is actually she's probably the most visible, most prolific, and the most courageous, and the most in a way established writer, and young Tibetans that writing in Chinese, and that we now came to like even and many in here that know her, but I think she's not alone in some sense that of course we don't have a second person like Wesley who writes like this and who writes in such style with the content, but I think she represents some kind of a movement, some kind of a new phenomena, and those phenomena are something that we really should look into a broader historical perspective. And the generation she grew up, actually she's not that many younger than me, just a few years apart, and but I think there's a different sorry to say, it's like only 5 years younger than me. But I think she represents actually a different sort of generation than myself. And what I see is because of many reasons, geographically, family background, all those things that, it's very interesting to look her to understand a new generation. And she grew up in, her father was People's Liberation Army, it's pretty high up official. And although her mother was, grew up in Lhasa, I think she really grew up in a very different from, although, like she was born in Lhasa and then moved to Dazido, and it's like her experiences are quite different from like people like me who go through. It's like I grew up in the Pago, and very Tibetan sort of, family, and the language maybe a little different, all those things different. So I think this is made us almost like a different generation, although it's not by age, it's not that different. So by that, what I see is how they describe Tibet, how they feel about Tibet is very different. And like my mother, my parents' generation, they've seen Tibet, and then they come to terms with China took over Tibet, and they have the history, sort of the Chinese government nation, the state narrative of what Tibet was and what Tibet is, and I mean they physically experienced both, and they know what the narration is, and they're just forced to be sort of live with it. These two different worlds simultaneously. These are different, and like people like me who just born after 59, but we grew up. This is the norm. That the Chinese government description of Tibet, and then we hearing from the parents a quite different one, but this is such a different, but yet it's the world that we inherit and we born with it, so we normalize that world. But I think people like Wesley and the whole generation after her, younger than her now, those grew up in universities in China, these people, they're born with and live with this liberation narration, this Chinese come, liberate Tibet, and all those things, and they're really born with this one sort of world view and world of understanding of Tibet. But what happened is when they go to university, they're really highly educated. They are much better educated than my generation and people, Tibetans before my generation, and you can see now these are very, very different. So much, in terms of literature, reading things, they're so much better educated. And then these people, when they grow up, then they certainly in after 80s, particularly late 1980s, they confront with the other world of Tibet, the different history, different experience. It's so different from the state narrative. And when they confronted these two different worlds, and they certainly, these for me, I was born with this whole world as some kind of norm. For my parents, they have to live with it, although they know there's a contradiction. But people like Wesley in her generation, younger than her, for them, it's so almost like inconsolable sort of contradiction, these two. And these met with they also searching their own identity. And I think Wesley really represents that kind of generation. And they maybe some point they feel like confused a little bit, And I didn't mean by all sort of negative way, but they sort of, anybody wants to search some kind of identity, is always have to go through that process. And by doing that, they are becoming the most critic of this Chinese government state narrative of Tibet. And they find their own new identity. And I think this is really, really typical because she's so visible. I think it would be interesting to look at her to understand so many younger Tibetans who have similar experience. And her writing, her writing is she writes about in poems and how shocked she was when she heard those stories. But I grew up with this story, and we thought this the norm. And for them it's such a contradiction, this thing. And I think the part of it they have to go through the process is also changing China. Of course, it's very important changing. And China is like, when I grew up in Tibet, Cultural Revolution, before that and after Cultural Revolution, with such a neat, clean story about Marxism, liberation, all those things, to China really moved to a complicated story. And Chinese are looking for their own identity. Chinese states are looking for their identity. And the Marxism, the communism is no longer a story that anybody believes. And in that process, Chinese people, young Chinese, the people who go to college with them and classmates with them and roommates with them, these people looking at the roots. They're looking for Chinese roots, of course. And while we were in this college, there's a sort of utopian communist sort of view. It's very easy to some Chinese, my roommate can understand, I understand. We can both either buy or just don't buy. But when their generation, new generation, went to China, they have to searching for roots, their own identity. And the Chinese are very looking at the Chinese nationalism. These are really nationalist Chinese young people, all just people who really broad intellectual. They think where China should go, what we think about it as China. They're always looking back to look the Olympic ceremony. It's all about the dynasty and all those things. And certainly the young Tibetans who are really well educated, they cannot identify with this. Because this is not part of their experience, this is not part of their culture, this is not part of their civilization. And certainly these questions are becoming very interesting. They have to be confronted with it. And with this lot of writings and the people who are similar how to write about those things. And these are, in any normal society, would be a very normal sort of searching for roots, searching for identity, searching for answer. But in China, this is a politics. This is political. These are forbidden. And since these are forbidden, this is becoming a political sort of a conversation that the state has to try to repress, and the Tibetans have to try to these blogs we're talking about, the first blog that where she's becoming quite prominent. That time she's not using her real name. It's newtibet.com. It's created by this young Tibetan, Sonam. And it was like amazing. And when there's the first time this was like a flock of the young Tibetans, universities, they asking all those questions, and including herself using a Degawa, that her name. And if somebody who's older, I was reading those things. Like there are more questions than anybody can answer. And in these people who participate in this debate, there's very few people answer. But there's so much questions, and I see these young Tibetans move from that stage, and certainly these used to be the conversation maybe in the private and room or family or friends or bar, some kind of thing, and certainly moved to the cyberspace, therefore becoming public arena, becoming public conversation. And this is really important, I think, with this contribution to this whole process is she was one of the person in the forefront, sort of moving the line that the Chinese draw. You're not allowed to publicly talk about this one. She was really pushing that line, and there are a lot of other Tibetans coming behind her. And she has been always the forefront to really pushing that what's allowed to talk about it, what is allowed to think about it, and what's allowed to discussion about it. She was really in the forefront pushing this. And these are not happening in a vacuum. Of course, I talked about what's changing China. Another thing is China is also in the past couple, like 10, 20 years, it's changed so much, is this enormous sort of Western intellectual literatures that translated in Chinese. And I could see, this is typical, but by all means she's not alone. There's a lot of young Tibetans so much influenced by this. When I was like, I just like to give this example, like, compared to my generation. So when I was there, it's like we read Marxism, the school teaches Marxism. And this really doesn't help us to understand the Tibetan situation. It's always a class struggle, It sometimes makes sense, most times it doesn't make sense. And then, like when we heard about it, like Freud, this is really new at that time. It was also, here's really old, right? But what happened is, in the past 15 or 20 years, in Chinese they translated a lot of Western intellectual thoughts in books that these Tibetans are reading, and suddenly they find a new way to understand their existence, where Tibet is in China, and who they are. And typical, with this, like they're going into sort of post-colonial critics, that literatures, one thing she writes all about, Orientalism. Edward Said, it's like she told me she read cover to cover many times Orientalism and on intellectuals, and this certainly it just makes sense for them. It's like when we were in school reading Marxism, it didn't make sense. It doesn't help us to understand, but these did help them to. And another thing is like I saw in the blog they're looking at like those subaltern sort of a bunch of Indian intellectuals. They're looking back how the colonial British period, even not necessarily always British wrote it, right? But it's like even Indians wrote their history, their story, and these Indian intellectuals were confronting with this, saying that we have to have a new sort of a story. And when the young Tibetans reading those, including Woeser, it was like, wow, this is certainly, you can show you that there's one essay that he wrote is really, I think it's really good. It's like, who representative, who has the right to tell our own story? And so far, the Tibetans always been the silent one. The people who themselves should telling the story. And these are the part of this new idea. They didn't come up with it, but they learned from these different Western thoughts. And then finally, I think okay.
No rush.
Then I think it's another important, of course, Tibet itself is changing. It's changing, and these young generations looking for their sort of place in this changing in Tibet. And economically, in today's China, it's like these are becoming much more sort of naked. For example, particularly after March 13, Chinese sort of used to be they have a state narrative, or all the minorities are happy, or this. They also tear down this sort of image. They really just down to the real problem. In some ways, exaggerated. And the Tibetans also, those young Tibetans who go to college, and they also have to confront with this, where they are and their identity. And this process, I think, was really represent. That's why I think there's so much, in some way, when she writes those things, it has such a sort of, the most common comments that before she was kicked out from that block and from China. In the very early days, you look. Most of the young Tibetans, they write, so, oh, you just said my, always saying my heart, whatever the language that I have, and this is one thing. And then they try to really now. I think these people are trying to the first stage is sort of. They're not only talking about the middle way vision that His Holiness, they're discussing about this, and also it's, I think a lot of them just looking back, saying how are we going to describe Tibet, how are we going to express Tibet. And I think Woeser is one thing that I don't think is collected into the books. One essay I think is a really, really important one. I think is she wrote about this Chinese travel writer, and as a really well-known travel writer, and he wrote a beautiful essay. I didn't see the original, but I read her her critic of that work. Introduction, yeah.
To his book.
His book. No, I think this is her essay in a magazine that she critiqued of it, and it was a little tribe. It's called Ujinbelong. It's in Tibetan. It's like they used to in Ningmaba, and this telling that there's some little villages hidden, and when the Tibetans are so desperate, and we research and we discover those hidden villages. It's a beautiful story, Ujinbelong. And this Chinese guy, this Chinese writer, he wrote a beautiful story. And in Changtang, in late 50s, how he described this tribe, and this the leader of the tribe, and saying that we have to search those hidden villages. So he left the whole tribe and moved. And the way he wrote, like very romantic. And then finally, they end up in Xinjiang, and they lived there. And the man died. And then after 30, 40 years later, his daughter, a young woman, and he come up to say that this hidden village we have to go find. And she left the whole village and returned to their own original grassland. I mean, it looks like a beautiful romantic story. It's today's sort of after post-communist Chinese writing about Tibet. And communists would write about liberation, all those things, and this guy would already get rid of all those political rhetoric. It sounds like romanticized Tibetan. So I think I really like that with S.S. Best is she criticized that narration, and it was so moving. And she said actually she also met that tribe. She also heard the story, but what her heard is very different from the Chinese guy describing. And what she heard is in late 59, the Chinese armies are chasing, and this tribe escaped. They run away, the whole thing, the whole village. And they end up in Xinjiang. They didn't realize where they were, and they settled down. And finally they realized they didn't get out of the country. Actually, they stay in Xinjiang, they stay in China. And after 30, 40 years later, and they will come back. And probably these hidden village story, they all are true, but somehow this Chinese writer just left out the most important part of the story, right? And I mean, she's saying that's how you describe in Tibet. So we have to have a voice to tell our story, and I think her most important, yes, everybody is like so courageous. She's criticizing Chinese government, all those things. I think most important part of her work is she's retranscribing Tibet and Tibetan story in Chinese language, and I think that's really significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tseten. So Andrew, who joins us today from New York, we owe a great debt to Andrew for bringing us this collection of poetry in English. Those of us who don't know Chinese, and people all over the world, new audience for Woeser's poems. And Andrew was very humble and modest in his biography. He's just got one sentence here that he worked as a copy editor, a nurse's aide, and a software engineer. But what he doesn't mention is that he's also a very fine poet himself. And he was so captivated by Woeser's work and her use of the Chinese language, the beauty of her poetry, that he took it upon himself to work with Woeser and with her friends to produce this wonderful, eloquent collection of poetry in English. Worked very quietly for many months to do that, and published it under an imprint that he created, Ragged Banner Press. And all the books are for sale today, so if you don't already have a copy, hope you'll buy one. So Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And I'd like to address myself first to the fraternity of the stairway back there. I fully understand the strategic value of holding the flank, but if any of you are a little tired of sitting on the floor, there are chairs down here, and I certainly don't mind waiting while you find a chair. Okay, the rest will remain. Well, as As Kate said, I had the temerity to undertake a translation of some of this fine lady's poems. And, of course, some of you probably know a great deal more about her work than I do. And some of you possibly have only heard her name and have not read much of her work. I would like to think that this translation could be of interest to both groups of people. Those of you who are fluent in Chinese and know her work, if you have time to look at this translation, I'd love to hear what you think of it. And of course, those of you who can't read Chinese any better than I can, maybe this will be an introduction for you. My own enthusiasm is not that of a critic, but of a reader. And I would like to think that many people, even those without a specialized interest in Tibet, could find great interest and enjoyment in Woeser's poetry. And I think probably rather than talking about her, the best thing I can do is read some of her poems. I'd like to start with a deceptively simple one that she wrote a couple of years after graduating from college. She had gone to college in the capital city of Sichuan province. Then she worked as a journalist for a couple of years. Then she managed to go back to Lhasa, and amid all this questing and seeking, she then a few months later went back to Chengdu and got together with a young man she had known while she was in college. And this is what she wrote. After a few years, you're where we started. I'm at the other end. By plane and car, I too arrive where we started. After a few years, you've grown a bit. I've grown a bit. We look as though we'd grown up at the same time, still youthful, impulsive. After a few years, I'm covered in dust with a scarred face, but everything's fine, just fine. I wear a necklace of little skulls to show my nonchalance. After a few years, you look so neat, scholarly, could be 17. The tears inside glint like crystals. No hand could wipe them dry. After a few years, finally we sit down together, at first apart, then edging closer, surrounded by the clamor of the crowds and jittering neon. I want to speak, but hold my peace. You want to speak, but hold your peace. What could we keep talking about? The motifs of sadness and a reluctant or enforced silence occur again and again in her later work. And perhaps they are the only hint that this is a specifically Tibetan writer. Of course, unlike the scene described in the poem, Woeser has not kept her peace. She has been outspoken. In fact, she stands out for being outspoken. And this might itself be a subject of inquiry. All the highly educated, articulate people in the People's Republic of China, and yet there are so many topics which are rarely discussed in public. There's only silence. Woeser addressed this question in a brief work. It's called Serves You Right. She wrote it almost exactly a year ago in Beijing. The blades, we know, surround us like a forest. But see, there drips from each knife edge the sweetest honey. Can't help sticking out our tongue to lick. Mmm, such sweet honey. Take another lick, and another lick, and another lick. Oh, my tongue! What happened to our tongues? How did they get cut off? But it is, as someone keenly aware of the tragic history of one land in particular, that Woeser has become so widely known. One of her finest poems, which touches on many themes, many events in history, sprang from a chance discovery at what we would call a flea market. She published it on her blog a little more than a year ago. Remembering a Battered Buddha. Days since I left Lhasa, but still I see that statue of the Buddha with its face bashed in. It was on a street vendor's stand in front of the Tromsikang neighborhood office. I noticed it from a distance. I'd gone to Tromsikang market to buy droma, but at the sight a sudden grief assailed me. I drew closer, couldn't help it, to this thing so crushed. It seemed alive, leaning against a shelf in agony. The face hammered, an arm hacked off, the whole figure chopped off at the waist. Hurting so bad, leaning against a rack of the goods that surrounded it. Soy sauce, bean jam, salad dressing, and roll after roll of toilet paper, all introduced into our life long ago from inland China. Around its neck an ornament, once exquisite, inlaid with colored stones, and at its chest a wondrous beast with lion head and body of man, stacked on a fragmentary chorten. In what sacred shrine or pious home were these things once venerated? Hurting so bad and leaning against the rack of merchandise, it emanated the calm of still waters, but pain stabbed into my marrow. As I looked on in grief, I sensed a story being played out that had both a present and a past. I was moved by the shadowy fate that had brought us together, as if melted snow from the high peaks had filled my being. Hugging his knees, the peddler made a pitch. Come on, buy it. Don't the old Buddha look grand? When did it get beat up like this? I asked. Cultural Revolution, obviously. He glanced up. Had to be the Cultural Revolution. How much? I wanted to buy it, to take it home, but this peddler from Jiangxi wouldn't budge from 3,000. So with reluctance and regret and many an afterthought, I left that broken Buddha streaming rays of pain. I only took some pictures, so when I miss it, I can turn on my computer and have a look. Friends say it may have been a brand new Buddha, wrecked thus to fetch a higher price, and the link to the Cultural Revolution was a fiction. Maybe so, but the hurt remains. I wrote these these lines to try to let it go. You notice she doesn't feign certainty about things that can't be known. She doesn't know whether the statue was snatched from a shrine or a home, or whether it was fake. The history of which she speaks is all the more affecting because of her sobriety. But for all that, she is no detached observer. 8 years ago, and Miss Chen could perhaps correct my memory, I may be confused, but I think she has written that she was in Lhasa and she saw a number of people looking sad in the streets and she didn't know why. It was March 10. And then she heard from them, or she heard herself on the radio, the Dalai Lama speaking in English. She had to ask someone what he was saying. And he was alluding to the possibility that he might never return to Tibet. And on that day, she started writing 2 poems, one of which I'll read now, and the other will come last in the reading. This is called A Vow. That night the moon was dim, the moonlight streaming through his home. He went far, wandering. O God that dwells in moonlight, be my witness. I shall, in this life, meet him again. Only because I keep in my heart a rosary left behind. Oh, the 108 beads are 108 longings. That night, the water of the stream was icy cold, the river flowing past his home. He went far, wandering. Spirit of the river, be my witness. I shall, in this life, meet him again. Only because I keep in my heart a rosary he left behind. Oh, the 108 beads are 108 longings. This was one of many poems she wrote that looked to the past. But contemporary events also have inspired or provoked her. I'm sure everyone here knows the story of what happened in 1995, all the drama and tragedy surrounding the selection of the Panchen Lama. At that time, she was working in her state-sponsored job as a state-sponsored writer and member of the Writers' Union, and sitting in the office and reading the official announcements that were circulated, she felt great indignation and wrote a powerful poem, which I won't read, but it's in the book if you're interested. One that was somewhat clothed in symbolism and deliberately veiled language. 10 years later, having lost her state-sponsored job and no longer living in Lhasa, she wrote a poem that was more direct and that reflected not only on what had happened, but on what was still happening. And I find it remarkable, not only for its directness and power, but for the compassion she shows to almost everyone involved. The Panchen Lama. If time can cover up a lie, is 10 years enough? A child matures into a clever youth, but like a parrot, mumbles by rote the phrases that will please his masters. The other child, where is he? The scar-like birthmark on his wrist recalls his previous life, before, when for 10 years he sat trussed with tight handcuffs in some Beijing cell no ray of light could reach. What bruises mar him now, the child no one hears from. If there are 9 levels to the darkness, at which one are they trapped, he and the other? If there are 9 levels to the light, to which do they aspire, he and the other? Perhaps in each phase of darkness and of light, where one is trapped, the other aspires. Wangchuk Sum, the world's turned upside down, that the pain of the impermanence of samsara has struck home to the Panchen Lama. In Tenchula's notes for this gathering, she stressed that Woeser has become a voice for Tibet, and perhaps to some the voice of Tibet. I don't think she tries to speak that way. I think she tries to speak for herself as honestly as she can. But occasionally, it does seem that she is speaking for her people. And I'd like to close with a poem that seems to have a more than personal authority, one that she also wrote on March 10 of the year 2000. Come home. In a frigid winter, a gale blew the prayer flags away. The eagle of my spirit was wounded by a demon, shocked into flight. It makes me weep to think of it. Many years gone by, a great land thick with incense. Where may the eagle of my spirit nurse its wounds? That pained countenance, it makes me weep to think of it. Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. Come home. Let the eagle of my spirit come back home. Come home. Let the eagle of our spirit come back home. It is my hope that through the work of those gathered here, and perhaps in its small way through the aid of this translation, more people will hear that voice and think about what she has to say.